Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
You can't change your past, but you can control how you feel about the past and how you use that to drive your future.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 61, where we break our summer fast. That's right, I've been out of commission for the past month and a half, and now I'm back, and it's time to get back into the saddle. So as always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. And today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Zhang about her book, Hard Mother, Spider Mother, Soft Mother. Zhang is an international transplant and former physicist who writes science, science fiction, and fiction, in no particular order. Her prose and poetry have appeared in publications such as Uncanny, Strange Horizons, and Fireside. She splits her time between the East Coast and the internet. Follow her at HALYZHANG.com. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I'm your host, John Monaster, and I'm very excited to be here in the Brooklyn Public Library this Sunday afternoon with my guest, Zhang. Hal, say hello.
Hello.
Oh, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. It's going to be fun, and I'm excited to talk about your short story here, your Hard Mother, Spider Mother, Soft Mother story. I think it's, I was glad to see it kind of pass through my inbox and reach out and find out more about it. So, but I always like to kick off by having the author kind of tell us in your own words what the story is all about.
Sure. I would say the story is from a very sort of personal point of view, but I try to make it, not totally just myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the protagonist's name is Ellery Long, and she is a Chinese American, sort of 20-some-year-old who just graduated. It's kind of like feeling out what she wants to do next in life. So she goes back to live with her mom, Valerie, who kind of starts behaving really strangely over the course of them living together. And eventually her mom just randomly decides to leave with no indication of where she's going or what she's doing. And Valerie's disappearance basically makes Ellery very upset and confused, and she starts to recover all these memories of her childhood, which distress her even further because they don't seem to be normal childhood memories, right? These are like memories of just being maybe left alone for a really long time, or just things that didn't make any sense, like didn't seem like normal parental things that she had repressed for many years. And so this is kind of a very I would say internalized story about Ellery figuring out how to reconcile her past with her present as she looks for her mother. Yeah,
that's a really interesting summary, and part of what I want to get into is that summary didn't really bring in any of the science fiction-y parts of the story, which is very interesting to me. So we can talk about that in a minute. But thanks, that's really helpful. And so I always like to start off kind of getting into the creative process a little bit before we talk about really the meat. So just to take a step back, what was your process for putting this together? And I know that you've done a lot of other work, you've done poetry, you've put out other books, and so how is that process changing for you over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I don't qualify as having written other books. I've contributed to stories in anthologies.
You've done some writing.
So, yeah, I've done a bit of writing. So I actually started writing in 2017. So I'd written random things before that, when I was a kid, but I don't think that really counts. In 2017, I was just sitting one day in lab. I was a physics grad student, and I was just really frustrated with how the experiment was running, and I suddenly decided to just write a story, not about the experiment, but sort of science fiction story. And so from then on, I kind of re-caught the writing bug, so to say, and I just kind of wrote everywhere where there was a pause. I really like to write on like train trips, my daily commute to and from work. I find that really productive because there is no internet, which is really the most addictive and dangerous thing for me. That's why I don't get anything done. So this story started with just the opening line popping into my head, and it just proceeded from there. And in general, the way I write is very much like I'm not a planner at all. I don't know how things go. I just keep writing until I get to the end, if that makes sense. There are stories where I do know what happens, and then I'm not really tempted to finish them because it feels like to me I already know what happens. And it's kind of strange that way, but yeah, writing for me is almost a way of discovery and exploring and figuring out what actually happens.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you have to be able to surprise yourself.
Right.
To write.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay. So would you say there's any particular step that's really hard for you as you go through this process?
Yes. Usually what gets me is I'll write parts of the story, and then I'll get stuck somewhere in the middle, and then I have to really think about how to get to the end because, again, I don't plan anything. For this story in particular, I got pretty stuck near the end, actually, and I wasn't sure what would happen in the end. I'll try not to spoil too much here, but so the first version of the story, which was like half the length of what it is now, it just ends with Ellery and her mother both in the hospital, and then that's it. And it took me a while to discover that this was not really where I wanted the story to end. It's not just, ending with Valerie found, so to say, like, or Ellery knowing where she is, but it is also a way of, it was really important to me that Ellery kind of reconciles different versions of her mother in her mind and kind of figures out for herself, like, what she wants to do moving forward with her mother and maybe with her life.
Yeah, that there's some closure to
Right.
everything that's been brought up here. It doesn't just sort of end abruptly, which is another form of closure that does happen in stories.
That's true.
So, so how are you personally connected to all this? I feel like you've sort of dropped some breadcrumbs so far that there's something about you in all of this. So how are you connected to the story?
Yeah, so I would say, well, superficially, Ellery is Chinese American, and so am I, but it goes beyond that, right? So part of the inspiration for the story was that I was just casually talking to my parents, discussing things that happened in my childhood, and they didn't remember many of these really important events that I remember. And that was really startling to me that, that I and my parents can remember my childhood so differently. Like they thought sort of that I was an easy child to raise up, but I remember all these different conflicts that they just don't think happened. And it's almost like I was calling, I was feeling like accidentally gaslit or something, right? Because now I'm like, wait, did that actually happen? Or did I just make that up?
That is weird that they sort of decided to remember the best.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of parents might go the other direction.
Right. Well, I think in my case as well, I have a sibling, and they think, they like to say, my bringing up was easier than bringing up my brother. But I don't know if that's actually true. Well,
Well, I think that's part of what the book gets into, and it sounds like you got into with your parents as well, which is the sort of the fungibility of memory and what it all means and what is true, really. Right. If we all are trying to decide between ourselves what a memory is. Yes. So, yeah, that's interesting. So I want to think about what you just said, which is kind of the idea of some of the themes that you explore, and particularly around identity, the idea that, who are we? Are we more than, the collection of data points that can be gathered about us? And then at the beginning of the book, you deal with both that and the idea of family And like you said, Ellery and her mother, and Ellery's living at home again, and was this mean with her mom, and the mom starts behaving strangely. And so I guess I want to know why, to you, those were, that's where we had to start. We had to start with identity and trying to understand that, and then trying to understand that within the bigger context of family, and how in your mind is identity connected to family?
I think part of the reason that I wrote the story and wanted to write the story was, so I'm an immigrant to the United States. So I lived in China for like the first 10 years. And so like Chinese society and Western society have very different viewpoints on, individuals and our relationships to family, right? And one thing that always strikes me a lot is I like reading advice columns for no good reason, but one thing that's interesting is that lots of times people write in and be like, well, my parents are old now and they're like racist and awful people and abusive and et cetera, so what do I do? And often the answer would be, well, of course you just stop talking to them, just be estranged, right? You don't have to deal with them anymore. And that's just like advice that would never be given in China, right? Where it's the family ties are just so much more important and part of who you are. And of course, there are people estranged from their families in China, but I think the proportion is much smaller than here. Well, I don't know the actual figures, but that's my guess.
Yeah.
And so part of it is, for me, like kind of reconciling the Chinese values with American values, growing up and as an adult now, right? So there are a lot of things that are commonly done in China, which may not be seen as appropriate here in the U.S., especially towards children, right? It's a lot more acceptable, I would say, to spank your children or punish them in ways that to supposedly make them better or behave better or because they won't listen to you and whatnot. And it's really interesting to me because there are things that we consider really bad here that are totally acceptable there, and maybe vice versa as well. So I thought that would be kind of an interesting element to put into a story. So it's not explicitly stated in the story, right, that this is Chinese versus American kind of struggle, but I try to make it kind of a very, very individual story about just one family and how they deal with this struggle of like the self versus the family, and can you just cut ties with people once they've done something bad to you, or do you try to reconcile and try to figure out what it is, how these things happen and how to move forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of my next questions was thinking about the family, because in essence the family there is tiny, right? There's two people.
Yes.
And I think that most of us, or at least for me, that's not an experience that I am familiar with, having such a small core group
right.
to deal with. I mean, it's sort of like it's just you and then someone else, and that's
right.
it. And so I feel like, the advice column advice would be even more difficult to implement, if you're just like, well, my mom's crazy, and they're like, well, then just leave, and you're
right.
like, well, but that's it, that there's no one else. So the one thing I wanted to mention is that, in the story, this is maybe the continuing slight science fiction element, but there's no father figure, right? And there's really no one else mentioned, but I think especially the father figure, not having that. And so, I think in the story, it's that the mom, Valerie, she does artificial insemination, or I forget if there's a different technology than that.
Right, it's not explicitly stated. It was just your father is a sperm somewhere, and that's all she tells Ellery, right? And that's part of the story as well, that Ellery doesn't know so many things about her past, and it's really upsetting to her that it seemed like all this was kept from her.
Yeah, and so I think that's part of it too, is that when we find out, or when we find out there is nothing more, I think this is a big part of what she's running into. How is that affecting us? How is not having a father figure here? And it's interesting because I think a lot of people get into the idea of, well, a single mother can do just fine, and there's like, we don't need to rely on anyone here. Was that a part of why you included that? Why was it important to you to not have a father here, and how did that ultimately kind of affect Ellery?
Yeah, these are really good questions. Yeah, I would definitely want to preface this by saying, like you're saying, yeah, single parents can do a great job parenting, or, two moms, two dads. But in this special case, I think Valerie really decided to cut off all contact between Ellery and anybody else in the expanded family, right? And it was mentioned near the end that kind of, yeah, you had grandparents, but I didn't let you see them. And it's this weird way that she just really wanted to take control and just mold Ellery into whoever she wanted to make her, with no outside influences. Of course, that's impossible, right? And as Ellery grows up, she realizes, wow, other families are very different from mine, and it takes her a long time to realize it, but she does eventually realize it. And I thought that was, well, I decided to write it that way because I thought it was very interesting. It's like almost like Valerie decides to get rid of the traditional Chinese family structure and just have it be my daughter and I, but Ellery then has to deal with these consequences of trying to figure out, well, should I kind of cut off this last tether from between me and anybody I'm biologically related to, or should I try to work things out with her? I thought it created interesting conflict, and also, like, honestly, as a because it's a short story, there's only so many things you can get to.
Yeah, you kind of have to pick and choose.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's one of the things that I was actually really impressed by in the story, is that there are so many different major themes and ideas brought up and discussed, and obviously you don't get into each of them in depth, and maybe that's right. If you ever turn this into a book, maybe that's what you can think about doing. But just the initial ideas are sprinkled all about the book in many different ways, and I think that was pretty well done. So
thank you.
Yeah. So the next kind of major plot point is like that Valerie leaves, and it's not clear what's happening, and Ellery kind of calls in to the police, and the police aren't sure what to do here, because it's like Ellery doesn't even have a photo, and it's just like this weird sort of situation that Ellery finds herself in. And I think for me, Ellery's response to all of this was what was most interesting. You'd sort of feel like, just to project a little bit, but if I were just by myself living with my mom disappeared, I would kind of go berserk to some degree. I would just be like calling everyone and posting notices up, and and whatever I could do, I think I would be trying to do. And it's interesting that it seems like Ellery takes it a lot differently than I might have expected, and then but still in a way that shows that she deeply cares and maybe is even obsessed about her mom. But she doesn't, respond in like a freak out, intense way. So maybe like talk about like who I think this shows us a lot about who Ellery actually is, in the level of caring, but also the way in which that is shown. And maybe just talk a little bit about that moment in the story.
Right. So basically, the moment Valerie leaves, she's like, "Oh, I'm going to go off on this important mission. Goodbye," and she just leaves, right? And so Ellery's first thought was just kind of like, "Oh, I guess that happened. Okay." I think it didn't really fully sink in for her how important and crucial it is that she be found, until she decides to, okay, like, I have to go to the police and really find my mother. I think this is on both of their parts, that even when Valerie, her mother, is not well, her mother still projects this aura of like, I'm totally fine, I can take care of myself.
Mm-hmm.
And Ellery, on the other hand, she wants to pretend everything's okay. And this is both in her personality, the way she's brought up, like she's a very shy and quiet, and just tries to be conflict averse and just pretend everything's fine, right? This is a lot of like how she grew up, and she had to deal with all these really weird things happening around her by being like, okay, this is fine, like everything's fine. And so that's part of why she didn't completely freak out. And I think, yeah, a different person might have, like you said, try to contact everybody else and try to find Valerie through whatever means necessary. But for Ellery, she even tells all her friends that, oh, my mom's just not well, or it's fine, nothing to worry about. And yeah, I think that really speaks to what happened to her and part of her personality, that she tries to just minimize things. And it's not really until her mother is really missing and she starts recovering all these memories of the things happening to her that she starts feeling increasingly confused and upset and becoming more and more emotional at the turn of events.
Yeah. Right. Ellery's mom runs away, Valerie runs away, and eventually she's found and just somewhere very far away, and it's not clear how she got there, and it's kind of this whole random thing. But you mentioned something, and I'm still not 100% sure. Like I got it correctly, but the police or paramedics can't just grab her and go. There's this kind of rule that a person has to be at the point of hurting someone else before they can be taken in. Right. And so I want to kind of explore that for a second, because you sort of wrote it as a compromise society agreed to. So I'm just curious, like what that all means, what kind of a compromise that is, and maybe why a society was able to kind of come to a compromise around that thing in particular.
Yeah, it's part of what I came up when I was envisioning this near future society, and I was thinking about how having this constant surveillance would change things. And I had decided that if the society stayed looking like a democracy where, the ruling power changes parties once every few years, and people would kind of keep trying to, have this like tug of war back and forth between maybe more liberal and conservative ideas, so to say. And I had decided that if this surveillance system was set up, then obviously many civil liberties groups would say, hey, this violates our individual liberties. But then I think politicians may be influenced by the benefits that surveillance can potentially provide in the lobbies, of course. But I think they would say, well, look, crime rates have gone down in these places because of the surveillance systems, and these people are very happy with the new individual personalized products that are much better suited for than generic products. So there are some benefits to surveillance. How about we just add this band-aid to improve civil liberties, such that you can't be committed against your will. You have to, like you said, either be hurting someone or maybe just demonstrate total lack of coherence. And so that's kind of the angle I decided to go with. That I thought this was something that might happen, that instead of really completely adding something to society and taking it away, that we would just keep trying to patch more and more things on there in really weird directions, and it would just get bigger and bigger in terms of the bureaucracy and the number of strange rules that might happen. So that was my idea of how it might turn out.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, because I think that's a pretty probable one, in the sense that you're right. Like, if you looked in the past, you can kind of see an upward trajectory of increasing surveillance and in various ways across government, across private sector, or whatever else. And at the same time, that increase in surveillance is, there's groups like the EFF and ACLU and all of them, and they're trying to fight and push back. And so there's kind of some safeguards or watchdogs or whatever put on that. And then it just turns into like this kind of back and forth battle to some extent.
Right.
So I can see how that might be the case. And I think especially it's interesting to contrast that with a place like China, like you were saying, where there are, to make it different in the sense that maybe the way that family is dealt with And so that's a cultural thing, like, and things like spanking are okay, and you have an extended family that's very important to you. But at the same time, there are other aspects like this constant mass surveillance that's happening in China that, I'm not an expert, but my guess would be that this sort of thing would never happen. Like there wouldn't be these sort of like nice compromises with groups that don't agree with what's happening. It just would kind of happen. So, yeah, I guess I wonder, like, is this future that you're describing one that is uniquely possible within the United States, and is it a United States story because of that? Or do you feel like this is something that could happen anywhere, just so happened that things were tweaked to fit within the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a good question. So while the actual story is set in the U.S., I think it's very much just the consequences of having increasingly technologically advanced nations with also, like I was saying, the different groups, each with different agendas and interests, and each having some voice in government, not just a dictatorship or just one party just rules and nobody else gets to have any input, right? And yeah, so that's kind of the feeling I try to convey. I think it could happen maybe in places like Europe, but they do have more privacy laws for now.
Yeah.
But I could definitely see that happening eventually. I think surveillance technology has become really quite scary. So I'm working in big data industry right now, and it's just crazy how much data there exists on each person from all different sources, and that they can really kind of reconstruct a picture of your life from data. So that's, I think, part of the world that we're coming to. Whether or not we like it or not, this is what's happening now, and we have to decide what to do about it, if anything.
And this like sort of directly leads into the next question I want to ask you, which is, at one point Ellery is given the opportunity to watch everything that ever happened to Valerie, and this is obviously sort of one of the more sci-fi elements to the story, and I think a great way of using science fiction to tell an important element of the story. And so, at the beginning we find out that there's like this kind of there's like a memory confusion element happening here. Some parts, it's unclear. I know definitely for me, like I have huge gaps in my memory from my young childhood. I think it's probably the opposite of what you were saying about you and your parents. Like I think my parents remember specific things about me and have told me stories that I have no knowledge of. So it's sort of the reverse, and it's interesting to kind of ponder like, wow, okay, so I was doing things as a kid and I don't know. So anyway, so Ellery can look at everything that happened to Valerie, and that means, of course, that happened to her as well. And she decides to. And so, first off, why would you or wouldn't you decide to do something like that is something that initially struck me. It's like, wow, I feel like that could go really interestingly, like really badly, to find out, like, who knows what you might uncover. So I guess, why did she want to do that? And, should we be worried about what we don't remember?
Right. I think in Ellery's case, she was given the option to view these memories, right? The police basically dumped it in her lap and was like, well, you can watch it if you want. And she kind of hesitates for a moment, but she decides that because she has all these bad childhood memories, she has to find out if they're real or not. And that's why she decides to view her memories. And I think, overall, it's probably not so good for us to be able to see everything that happened. I think this is a pretty often explored idea in science fiction. Different people have different ideas about what happens, but one of the things that happens is that we can now really keep score on each other really well, right? With the help of technology. But I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, because then we will remember every single past slide and, oh, look, you did this thing wrong in the past, and it's like our brains are not I don't think our emotions are equipped to have this kind of detailed scorekeeping. I think it's good that something's happened and we forgive each other and we move on, because otherwise we would be consumed by this, rage and need for correction of past grievances and whatnot. And I think that would just make it really hard to live for many people. So yeah, I don't think it's that good. And with particular with like parents and children, right? I think a lot of new parents know that they make all sorts of terrible mistakes, but they're glad that their child won't remember it. And that's definitely something that's perhaps better left in the past than say aired out again in the future.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's really interesting you point that out then, because I feel in the book, not only then do we have this aspect of memory, which is you can look at and find out about all these ancient memories, but you have the opportunity to change them. And this is another sort of sci-fi element that's been explored elsewhere. But, in this case, especially after seeing these memories, there's then an opportunity to say, okay, I mean, to kind of your point that, maybe it's not so great to keep score to this level, and maybe we should do something about these memories that are just there and maybe not so great and are reminding us of things that didn't go well, either as parents or children or whatever. But she doesn't really do that in the book. She has the opportunity and avoids it. And so I'm curious about, why someone would take the opportunity to look at old memories, knowing that you might see negative stuff, and then once you see the negative stuff, and like you were talking about, want to come to that realization that they are negative and things didn't go well and whatever. Why would you want to sit with that still? Why is that? Why are memories that are not necessarily so positive good to retain, or why were they something that Ellery wanted to retain?
Right. So the types of memory modifications in this near future world are pretty advanced. So you could have your memories completely removed, or you could just have the emotions disassociated with memory. So you could just have a bad memory, but not feel that bad about it. You could just be like an academic record in your brain, like, oh yeah, this happened to me, and well, that's all. I don't feel anything about it. And I feel like it's kind of a cliche, almost in science fiction, that people can choose to erase memories, but then in the end they choose not to, because then it will remove who they are, and so on and so forth. I think in this particular case, though, Ellery could have gone with the route of removing the negative feelings from her memories, but she chose instead to talk to her mother and reconcile with the real person who did these things to her. And I think that's really the important route that I chose for the book, for her to not, in the end, cut off ties, but to try to make it work out and try to actually fix something that's broken and not working, instead of just letting it go. And I think that's what was important to me, that Ellery tries to not fix these memories, but accept these memories and kind of get the full context around them with the real human mother that she has, as opposed to using some surgical means.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion just in today's times generally. There's so many different ways in which you can take that kind of metaphor, that idea that we need to actually deal with our problems, essentially, as opposed to taking a shortcut. I think that's kind of at a very high level what, at least to me, this was saying. And I think that's exactly the case, which is, there, whether with families, whether with medicine, whether with so many different things in life, we are offered shortcuts now. And I think part of what you were saying is, let's focus again on the here and now and the present moment, and trying to work things out with the people we care about.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, so as you can tell, people out there, this is a fascinating book. I'll give you one last question there. Is there any other ideas or anything else that you wanted to kind of get at that we hadn't talked about so far in this story?
Yeah, well, I think we were very thorough. Yeah, I think you did a really good job kind of sussing out the main themes in the book. I would maybe just end with the thought that, this is a very individual book of like a story of one family and what happened there, and it may not pertain to other families. I'm not saying everyone should try to talk to their terrible relatives.
Yeah.
But I think it's just something that everyone has to decide for themselves what to do. And I hope that everyone out there can kind of hopefully take away from this book a message that you can kind of control things. You can't change your past, but you can control how you feel about the past and how you use that to drive your future.
Cool. Well, I always like to check in on what else you might be up to or doing or working on these days. I know you mentioned your big data day job, I'm guessing, but is there anything else either with that or with your writing or anything else that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, so I've mostly been writing poetry for the past few months or so. So the story Hard Mother, Spider Mother, Soft Mother was written about a year ago. I find poetry somehow easier to write because I often can finish it in one sitting. These are short poems, nothing long. I just I'm trying to find having enough attention span for longer works is a pain because every time I sit in front of it, I have to kind of go back to where I left off, and that's not easy. So yeah, that's something I have to work out for myself, how to write long things again. And currently I'm working on a few stories of different levels of science fiction. And hopefully they'll see the world one day. So I was actually working on quantum computing in my graduate school. Yes, so I have various quantum stories that I would definitely like to get out if I can, ever finish them. But I hope so. Yeah.
I hope so too. That sounds great. And just so everyone knows, what is the best way to actually acquire this? I know you said Radix. That's RADIX. So what is the best way to get a copy of the story?
Yes, so they're an independent publishing house and bookseller, publisher in Brooklyn. So they sell books directly through their website at radixmedia.org. And if you just go there, you can see both this book and all the other chapbooks in the same series. And they're all about near futures and different aspects of what might happen in the future. And there's topics on like climate change and other sort of like animal, humans, and relationships, and lots of interesting things. So definitely check out the whole series. It's only available on their website because they actually handprint every single book, and they're actually really beautiful pieces.
Yeah, totally, they
like
are
letterpress, so you could just like cool.
It feels nice, and it's it's a great thing.
Yeah, definitely support indie publisher if you can.
Yes, always. Totally agree. Cool. Well, okay, let's do a quick thunder round, getting to know you, and then we'll call it a day. All right?
Sounds good.
Okay, so first question, what is your favorite food and or drink?
Yeah, so I love Chinese food.
Nice.
It's always like mom's cooking, right? It brings back all the
memories.
The good memories this time, yeah. So
is there a particular dish?
Yeah. When I go home, I always ask my mom to make like eggs and tomatoes, which is like the Chinese national dish, as some people call it. Not many non-Chinese people know that, but yeah.
So describe it. What is eggs and tomatoes?
It's just like stir-fried scrambled eggs with tomatoes. It actually came from the Middle East, like on the Silk Road. And now it's like very, very popular in China as like really cheap and delicious.
Yeah.
And I also love like pork rib soup. It's also a very traditional Chinese dish.
Okay.
Yep.
Sounds good.
And drink-wise, I love boba, like milk tea. I actually just had one before I came here today.
Nice. Get you through the interview.
To them. Yeah.
Yeah. It's okay. There are worse things to be addicted to, I think.
That's true.
Cool. Where's your favorite place you've ever been?
So I've been to a lot of places that I enjoyed. And one place I really liked was actually The Hague in the Netherlands. That was one of the first places when I visited that I could actually see myself at home there. Like,
oh wow,
that's not that was not a home.
Yeah,
obviously.
So what elements did it have that made you think that?
Right. I don't really know. I mean, maybe because I was in Boston at the time, and it kind of reminded me of like Boston, but in Europe. But it was just an overall vibe, and the way the houses were set up, and it was very beautiful. And I'd love to go there again someday.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Yeah. And last question, if you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
So that's a tough one. Maybe I would go with a nerdy answer, in that there's a lot of unsolved math and science questions out there that we're trying to figure out, and I would love to know the answers to some of them. Like, for example, in computer science, there's this really big debate that's just called P equals to MP, which actually takes a while to explain, but it's basically just a really big mystery of whether or not certain types of problems are hard to do with computers, or maybe they're actually not. There's like a shortcut to doing them on computers, and people have been figuring this out for decades, and it just seems like a really hard problem to prove either way. It's actually like a math problem.
That's interesting. And does quantum computing have any say in that at all?
That's a great question. Maybe. People are trying to work on it also from the quantum angle. So
so solving a hard problem to help science. I think that's a great suggestion. I don't know if I've ever heard that before. So fair enough. Okay. Well, thank you so much. The story again is Hard Mother, Spider Mother, Soft Mother, available on radixmedia.org. Hao Zhang, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, John. This was great.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.